The world knew Jimi Hendrix as an electrifying deity, a rock god who communicated through the language of howling feedback and fire, a spontaneous, psychedelic shaman who stood as the ultimate symbol of the 1960s quest for ultimate freedom. For those who were there, who lived through the seismic cultural shift between 1960 and 1975, the image remains indelible: the reverse-strung Stratocaster, the purple velvet, the plumes of smoke, and the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the sound. If you recall the moment the sun broke through the gray drizzle over the endless, mud-caked fields of Woodstock in 1969, you remember the sense of shared, generational transformation. Yet, the man behind the magnificent facade, James Marshall Hendrix, was an entity entirely separate from the myth. Backstage, shielded from the deafening acclaim, he was often a frightened, deeply private young man, perpetually struggling to find a stable corner, haunted by the very insecurity he projected so much strength to overcome. This gap between public perception and private reality was his essential tragedy. The world saw a man who wielded absolute control over his instrument. The man himself felt a daily, terrifying loss of control over his own life. The story, as commonly told, ends with a tragic overdose. But that simplified narrative ignores the meticulous legal and financial architecture built around him, an architecture designed to leverage his genius until the point of collapse. Behind the freedom he embodied lay a series of merciless, legally binding contracts, the terms of which were never fully disclosed to the public, a secret that became the slow, terminal countdown to his death. Every artist fears losing control, but for Jimi, this loss was not confined to a missed note or a broken string. It was a psychological affliction that seeped into every single breath he took during the final 3 years of his meteoric life. But then, in the years following that final, quiet morning in London, something shifted. The walls of silence maintained by the music establishment began to crack. Newly unearthed studio tapes, the faded ink of his own journals, and, crucially, the long-held testimonies of those closest to him started to weave a more complex, chilling tapestry. These were the whispers of the other musicians, the roadies, and the handlers who, for decades, refused to speak on record, finally shedding light on the details that truly mattered. They spoke of the pressure, the manipulation, and the quiet despair. 3 crucial signatures on an outdated piece of paper, a small, inconspicuous bottle of pills, and the finality of a bolted hotel room door would combine to write the definitive, painful history of rock and roll's greatest loss. And as the fragile dawn of September 18, 1970, arrived, the few hours that remained determined whether James Marshall Hendrix would achieve the longed-for, elusive freedom he desperately chased, or if he would forever be immortalized, and thus trapped, as the god of the guitar myth. The architect of noise, from Seattle shadows to London light. Before the vibrant, swirling chaos of the experience, before the legendary feedback loops, there was a rootless childhood marked by profound emotional instability. Jimi's early life in Seattle was a study in scarcity and abandonment, conditions that would forever anchor his deep-seated fear of isolation, a personal dread that amplified under the intense scrutiny of global fame. He found his voice, paradoxically, in the silence of his small room, the guitar becoming his first, most loyal confidant. When he first acquired a proper electric guitar, the very weight of the solid body, the cold, smooth feel of the strings, was a tangible reality he could hold on to. He started his professional life the way so many American rhythm and blues musicians did, traversing the grueling Chitlin circuit. This period, often overlooked by the mythology of the London breakthrough, was his apprenticeship in the relentless mechanics of performance. He learned to play behind the greats, Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, always standing slightly in the shadow, a brilliant but secondary figure. This constant motion, the uncertainty of payment, the brutal pace, inoculated him against the demands of the road but never against the gnawing loneliness. The pivotal shift, 1966 London. The pivotal shift came in 1966. Frustrated with the limitations of the backing band life, he found his way to Greenwich Village and eventually, through the intervention of Linda Keith, crossed the Atlantic to London. This was a world in full bloom, the mod culture, the psychedelic explosion, the heady rush of a creative generation shaking off the dust of the past. He was immediately seized upon by manager Chaz Chandler, a former bassist for the Animals, who understood not just his musical genius but his untapped visual and commercial potential. The legend was engineered with ruthless efficiency. From the moment he landed, the goal was shock and awe. The military jackets, the wide-brimmed hats, the iconic image of him kneeling over his instrument, demanding volume and feedback, it was all perfectly calibrated for the hungry London press. In the context of the 1960s rock industry, where artists still often deferred to the polished sounds of the major labels, Jimi's raw, untamed emergence was almost a statistical impossibility. It was a sonic revolution. Yet, beneath the flash, the foundational problems began immediately. The early contracts were messy, conflicting, and driven by desperation rather than calculation. He signed away rights and publishing to various parties, creating a legal morass that would consume the remaining years of his life and continue to plague his estate decades later. Those clauses, buried deep within the fine print, were the real chains, unseen by the thousands who worshipped him on stage. His early anxiety, a fear tied deeply to his childhood traumas, was only amplified by this sudden, overwhelming success. It was a private kind of terror, to be the world's greatest guitarist and yet to have the control of your life, your songs, and your finances entirely dictated by others. He started repeating a single question in the narrow backstage corridors, often with a cigarette burning down between his fingers, "Am I still me?" even as the roar for his return to the stage reached a fever pitch outside. That question, whispered over the years to a few close friends, spoke to a control that he felt slipping away daily. The turning point came quickly. As the experience rapidly conquered Europe and stormed America, the pace became unsustainable. The relentless tour schedules of 1967 and 1968, meticulously tracked by his management, were not designed for artistic longevity but for maximum market penetration. They were playing hundreds of shows a year. The moment Jimi felt a sliver of peace, the machine demanded movement. This constant motion became a physical and psychological affliction, turning the pure act of playing guitar, once his salvation, into a necessary, agonizing chore. The famous, often romanticized drug use was, for Jimi, a complex and terrifying reality. The stark truth of his reliance on various substances, from downers to stay calm before a show to uppers to sustain the brutal energy demands, was the agonizing loneliness of addiction. It was the desperate attempt to turn off the ceaseless mental chatter, the business worries, the lack of private time, the pressure to produce the next, even more brilliant album. He confessed later to a roadie that when he was standing on the stage, often feeling his mind drift due to exhaustion, he felt the entire audience was watching not a performance, but an imminent train wreck. It was during a grueling multi-city run that the performance crisis, the true crack in the facade, occurred. He was performing to a massive crowd, the lights blinding, the amplifier noise overwhelming. In that split second of blinding light, Jimi realized for the first time that his fingers, moving with the preternatural speed of a genius, suddenly did not feel entirely his own. The man who had absolute command was momentarily paralyzed by the terrifying sense of disconnection. He stumbled through a solo, a rare, visible flaw that few in the roaring crowd noticed, but which was earth-shattering to him. That moment of dissociation, of realizing the godlike performer was now operating on sheer muscle memory and chemicals, haunted him. Years later, a studio engineer, present for the post-show breakdown, would recall the simple sentence Jimi muttered after the tape machines were finally powered down, a quiet confession that spoke volumes about his despair: "The noise is all they hear now." The roar of Woodstock and the search for sanctuary. The years of 1969 and 1970 marked the climax of his public career and the nadir of his private life. Woodstock stands as the quintessential moment of his mythological status. For our generation, who watched the footage of the Star-Spangled Banner, it was a primal, political cry, a sonic protest against the war, a statement of defiance. But for Jimi, it was simply another gig, a contractual obligation performed for a truly overwhelming, chaotic crowd. He had to wait hours for his slot, playing to a vastly reduced, exhausted audience at 9 in the morning. The political message was real, but the personal motivation was survival, the need to fulfill the promise of a spectacle, to ensure the next paycheck flowed into the labyrinthine account system he couldn't control. This constant motion became a physical and psychological affliction, turning the pure act of playing guitar, once his salvation, into a necessary, agonizing chore. The pressure led to a major stylistic shift and the breakup of the experience. Jimi wanted something new, something less tied to the expectation of psychedelic blues rock. He formed the Band of Gypsies. This pivot, though artistically motivated, was immediately complicated by legal actions. He owed his former manager Ed Chalpin an album under a previous, long-forgotten contract signed years earlier, a debt he had never managed to resolve. The Band of Gypsies was essentially created to fulfill this contract, a desperate attempt to use his art to untangle his legal knots. The infamous, raw power of the Live at the Fillmore East album was born not just of inspiration, but of commercial duress. As the timeline advances, the legal and health crises began to overlap dangerously. The clauses on the back pages of the early record company agreements were financial shackles disguised as an opportunity, a constant reminder of the money and control he had signed away. His isolation deepened. He became withdrawn, often preferring to tinker alone in his makeshift studio spaces or hotel rooms. The emotional toll of this public/private dichotomy was immense, leading to the painful erosion of his most intimate relationships. The women who entered and exited his life, often seeking the rock star, only to find the sensitive, overwhelmed artist, could rarely sustain the chaotic environment. The simple act of human connection was constantly undermined by the intrusion of business, drugs, and the unrelenting road. During his darkest period, in 1970, a simple piece of human connection cut through the chaos. A letter arrived, slipped under his hotel room door. It was from a woman who saw the fatigue in his eyes and the pain in his fragile smile, urging him not to save the world with his music but to save himself. This letter, a deeply personal plea for his sanity and survival, contained a single, poignant sentence: "Disappear for a year, let them scream." That small, folded piece of paper, which he reportedly carried in his pocket during his last days, became a symbol of the freedom he desperately wanted but felt legally, financially, and psychologically unable to seize. The cracking of the mask, the final performance crises. The constant push to perform took a serious toll on his mental and physical well-being. The reality of his addiction, stripped of any cultural romance, was the agonizing, lonely battle against his own exhausted mind and body. He was perpetually seeking stability in the midst of pandemonium. By mid-1970, his concentration wavered. Reports from his final European tour showed erratic behavior on stage. He was often late, sometimes visibly struggling to connect with the audience, occasionally stopping mid-song. During a show in Gothenburg, the tension finally boiled over. Frustrated with the sound and his own state of mind, he smashed his guitar not in a fit of artistic frenzy, but in a gesture of defeated anger, an explosion against the constraints he felt. This moment, captured on film, was interpreted by the press as the classic rock and roll excess, but those who were there witnessed a man throwing down his weapon, desperate to end the battle. The connections he made with other musicians, the famous element of his interaction with contemporaries like Clapton, Dylan, or Miles Davis, were often brief moments of genuine, equal peer-to-peer connection that contrasted sharply with his controlled business environment. These fellow artists, often visiting him backstage, were the few people who understood the crippling nature of his fame, and many would later confess that the intensity of the light around him suggested a short, brilliant circuit. As the timeline approaches its climax, the story accelerates into its dark, final chapter. Jimi arrived in London in September 1970, exhausted and spiritually depleted, yet with a flicker of hope for a new project, a different sound. He was actively trying to settle his legal scores, believing that once he fulfilled the remaining contractual obligations, he might finally be free to control his own creative destiny. The last days were a blur of meetings, rehearsals, and a desperate search for rest. His closest confidants watched as the public burden of the guitar god became an almost physical deformity, a hunch of exhaustion on his shoulders. His personal revelation, the story he confided about a profound childhood fear of being left behind, was, in hindsight, the beginning of his final emotional breakdown, the ultimate vulnerability exposed just before the end. The constant fear of being left, a product of his youth, morphed into the fear of being legally and financially stranded, trapping him in a cycle of performance. September 17th was spent trying to finalize plans, to talk about the future, to lay the groundwork for a life beyond the constant tour bus. He was seen leaving a friend's party, looking weary but perhaps resolved. The final hours were spent at the Samarkand Hotel. The contradictory accounts of the hours that followed, the medical reports, the varying times of discovery, the differing narratives of those present, created a mystery thread that continues to be pulled and questioned to this day. The hard facts are sparse and devastating: the ingestion of sleeping pills, the resulting aspiration, the struggle for breath. Pills. Siren flares. A cold, silent hotel room. The abruptness of his passing on September 18, 1970, was a catastrophic punctuation mark on the rock era. That single night became a breaking point that forever changed the rock music industry's view of the artist and the body, a tragic, final lesson in the dangers of artistic exploitation. In the context of the 1960s rock industry, where young idols were devoured by the very machine that created them, Jimi's end was the ultimate, painful realization of generational anxiety. The world received the news with a collective, devastating shock. Our generation, having lived through the rapid canonization of a figure who seemed to defy the rules of time and sound, now had to reckon with the cruel pattern of the 27 Club. The questions that immediately followed: what happened that night? Who was responsible for his contracts? What did Jimi truly want? Created a question cascade that continues to generate two new mysteries for every answer. The final medical reports and the conflicting narratives of those who were present only deepened the mystery, turning a tragic death into a source of perpetual speculation. The secret that plagued him to the end, the tangled web of contracts, came to the fore after his death. Those 3 early signatures on documents he barely understood became the focus of a decades-long fight over his multi-million-dollar estate. It revealed the full extent of the industry secret, that an artist's success was often measured by the percentage of control they successfully surrendered to others. The untold legacy. The true power of his legacy, however, remains in the work that surfaced only later. Years after the silence of his death, the tapes, the half-finished demos, and the scrawled musical notes emerged, revealing a constant, restless search for new sound. These archives confirm he was not merely an exponent of psychedelic rock, he was moving towards jazz, funk, and deeper, more complex sonic textures. These rediscovered live recordings and studio notes force us to question everything we thought we knew about the trajectory of his genius. His brief, brilliant life, from his roots in Seattle to the final, fatal hours in London, is a cultural milestone, a reflection of the entire generation's struggle for authenticity against the rigid structures of society and industry. The sorrow of his early death is not just the loss of a great guitarist, but the loss of all the music he still had left to create. Every young guitarist who learns to bend a string, who chases the perfect feedback shriek, is still following the path he forged. That one night, that one final decision, irrevocably altered the narrative thread of rock and roll, leaving us with a catalogue of unparalleled music and an enduring question: what further heights would he have conquered had he only had a little more time, a little more control? We, who lived through those years, understand that this was more than a rock and roll tragedy. It was the story of a fragile genius, consumed by the very light he so brilliantly generated.